Thinking, Fast and Slow is a 2011 bestseller by Daniel Kahneman, winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics. In 2012, the book won the National Academies Knowledge Dissemination Award for Best Writing. Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow covers three major areas of Kahneman's research at three different points in his academic career: early research on cognitive bias, later research on prospect theory, and later research on the theory of happiness. The author was born in 1934 and received his PhD in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. He is currently professor of psychology at Princeton University, professor of public affairs at Woodrow Wilson College, and a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Reason at the Hebrew University. His achievements in psychology have challenged the rational model of judgment and decision-making, and he is widely regarded as the greatest psychologist of our time, after Freud. His interdisciplinary research has had a profound impact on economics, medicine, politics, sociology, social psychology, and cognitive science, and he is regarded as the father of behavioral economics, and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. Kahneman was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for his contribution to proving through psychological experiments that the assumption that the process of economic decision-making is rational is not tenable, and for effectively combining the results of psychology with economic research to further explain how humans make judgments under uncertain conditions. Thinking, Fast and Slow is the culmination of Kahneman's decades of research in economics and behavioral psychology. Based on his understanding of human thinking, Kahneman combined his psychological research and proposed that human thinking can be divided into two systems. System 1 is instinctive thinking, which runs fast, consumes little energy, and is carried out unconsciously. For example, when we speak in our mother tongue, we do not have to think about how to pronounce a certain word or what the tone is. System 2, on the other hand, is careful thinking, which is slower and requires concentration and control. For example, when pronouncing an unfamiliar, difficult foreign language, you have to think carefully about how it is pronounced. Since System 2 consumes our mental energy, the human brain tends to use System 1 more than System 2. Although System 1 is faster and less energy consuming, there are times when System 1 does not know how to process. In addition, System 1's thinking is sloppy, looking only at the surface and ignoring the details, so it is easy for us to fall into the trap of cognitive bias. Daniel Kahneman has proved one thing through the results of various psychological experiments, that is, subjectively, we tend to think that we are rational, and it is the rationality that controls our decision-making. But in reality, intuition, System 1, is the basis for your actions, and most of your behavior is guided by intuition and accomplished unconsciously. Because conscious decision-making, System 2, requires concentration, the human brain is naturally inert and unwilling to pay more attention. Under this inertia, System 2 tends to accept System 1's intuitive judgment unconditionally. System 1's intuitive fast thinking becomes the real master of people's decision-making and behavior. System 2 is especially weak when people are low on energy. Since biases and errors are often associated with the dominance of System 1, the solution to the problem is simple in principle: slow down your thinking. By slowing down and proactively activating System 2, System 1's intuitive thinking can be rationally examined to compensate for System 1's shortcomings and to minimize the biases and misperceptions that arise from intuition. Daniel Kahneman believes that System 2 is lazy, and in order for this lazy system to become diligent, it needs to be deliberately prompted, either by self-prompting or by external prompting. External cues tend to be more effective when compared to these two methods. This can be done by asking yourself, do I really need to buy this thing? Or by external cues such as driving carefully in rainy weather and on slippery roads. The principle is related to a psychological characteristic of human beings. For example, it is often easier to question others than to question oneself, especially when one is under pressure to make a major decision, and questioning oneself about one's own decisions can lead to great psychological pain. This is the psychological principle behind the idiom of "the bystander is clear." If we are in an organization, there will be many bystanders around us. We can use the principle of the bystander to make it easy for them to give us advice. These bystanders will use their slow thinking from System 2 to help us correct our fast thinking from System 1 and avoid possible mistakes. Although group discussion can be inefficient, it is still meaningful in many cases because it can inspire many people to think slowly and minimize the biases and mistakes that can be caused by fast thinking. The author cites two methods of collective decision-making, the pre-mortem method and the water cooler talk method. Examining the body beforehand. Assume failure before making decisions. Assume that the matter will fail in the future, and then each person writes down the possible reasons for the failure according to his or her own understanding, and ranks them in order of importance and probability. This is a good way to plan ahead and prevent these factors from occurring, thus increasing the success rate of the work. Water cooler talk. Decision-making through relaxed conversation. Allow the decision maker to listen to the chatter and criticism before making a decision in a more relaxed setting, such as the office water cooler. It's not easy to face these criticisms, but it's a lot easier than having the courage to criticize yourself. Whether it is listening to others' gossip or self-reflection and self-criticism, the goal is to slow down your thinking, let System 2 run, and try to avoid the bias and mistakes that System 1's intuitive thinking and fast thinking may bring you. People generally assume that others are rational, or at least that rationality is not so easily influenced by distortion. Nevertheless, everyone has the feeling in the back of their mind that human beings are irrational to a greater or lesser extent. For example, if you ask a friend what his plans are for the new year, he will probably answer that he wants to do something new. He will probably answer that he wants to do fewer unproductive things, give up most of the time he spends playing computer games, and spend his time doing something more productive, such as learning a new skill or taking up a part-time job. You can tell he's being very rational in his answer, and he does want to maximize the benefits of his next year. But experience tells you that your friend will probably not actually accomplish his New Year's resolutions, and no matter how sincere and rational he may be in telling you about them, he will probably go back to playing computer games right after he says this. This seems to imply that a friend is both rational and irrational at the same time. He may be rational at one time, but he may be irrational the rest of the time. He is both rational and irrational at the same time. This is the real situation of human beings. We are all a combination of rationality and irrationality. Unfortunately, most of the time, human beings are more irrational than rational. Despite this, people still put too much weight on the decisions that the system gives them, and some people even become so superstitious about their intuition, i.e. when your girlfriend learns that you're having an affair from her sixth sense for no reason, and believes it, that they make bad decisions. Compared to the intuitive System 1, the deliberate thinking System 2 can enable people to give better, more rational and objective decisions when making decisions. System 2 will allow you to focus on cognitive work such as analyzing, calculating, etc. However, the disadvantage is that System 2 is more energy-consuming, lazy, and slow, and using it more often will also make people feel irritable and exhausted. Which system do most people use when making daily decisions? Of course, it is System 1. The fact is that System 1 is almost everywhere, whether you are aware of it or not, it is actually playing its role automatically. To what extent is System 1 automated? The book mentions that System 1 has a priming effect, also known as the initiating effect, which allows you to be influenced in your decision-making without realizing it. An experiment was conducted in the pantry of a British university office. For many years, members of this office had to pay for their own coffee or tea, but no one in the pantry would charge them, and they had to put money into the honesty box according to the prices of tea and coffee posted on the pantry wall. So no one knew if they would be honest and put in the right amount. One day a poster appeared above the price list with no warning or explanation, but every week a new image appeared, sometimes of a flower, sometimes of a pair of human eyes looking directly into the viewer's eyes. Although no one mentioned the new ornament during the process, the money in the honesty box changed dramatically. The experimenters found that the average amount of money dropped by office workers during the week was 3 times higher, per liter of milk consumed in the pantry, when the poster displayed a pair of eyes looking into the viewer's eyes than when the poster displayed flowers. This means that simply displaying a pair of eyes on a poster is enough to suggest to people that they are being watched and to motivate them to improve their behavior. It's worth noting that the effect is unobtrusive, and the subjects are not aware of the changes they are making. Whether you realize it or not, the system is always working. In an experiment conducted by psychologist John Bargh and his colleagues in New York City, 2 groups of students were given an exercise in word restructuring. The first group of students was required to use a number of words associated with the elderly, such as forgetfulness, wrinkles, grayness, and loneliness, while the second group of students was not required to use any of these words. Afterwards, the experimenter secretly recorded the walking speed of these students and found that the average walking speed of the students who used the words related to the elderly for sentence restructuring became slower than that of the other group of students. In other words, these students were influenced by the elderly vocabulary and unconsciously moved more like the elderly. The facilitation effect has been criticized in recent years due to the falsification of experimental data by some social psychologists. Psychologists generally agree that the facilitation effect exists, but that it is less effective and far less significant than some psychologists claim. Your System 1 is always working, and the facilitation effect can happen without you even knowing it, which of course means that when you make decisions, you are also influenced by System 1, and most of your decisions are determined by System 1, whether you are aware of it or not. And that's not good for people who want to keep themselves rational. System 1 makes more mistakes than System 2. In fact, Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist, became a Nobel Prize winner in economics because he and the late psychologist Amos Tversky proved that many human decisions are irrational, or imperfectly rational, which in turn inspired a whole new field of research: behavioral economics. How irrational are humans? For example, you can be unconsciously influenced by a counterparty in a transaction to inflate the amount you expect to pay. Inviolable rationality. If you are an experienced salesperson or businessman, you have probably observed the anchoring effect in your life experience and even utilized it. If you're dealing with someone and you're going to sell them a watch for $10,000, it's a good idea to start with a higher price, say $12,000, so that the other person is influenced by the message, and although he then responds by trying to keep the price down, you know that he may have only been willing to pay $8,000, but now he's already upped his mind to something closer to $12,000. But you know, he may have been willing to pay $8,000, but now he's upped the amount he's willing to pay in his mind to something closer to $12,000, and he's landed in the $10,000 range. It's understandable, but what you may not realize is that people's decisions can be influenced by unsupported, irrelevant information just because they've been exposed to it, as in the experiments conducted by Lehman and Tversky. Tversky and I did an experiment with the Wheel of Fortune, a wheel labeled with numbers from 0 to 100, but designed so that no matter how we spun the wheel, it would only stop at the numbers 10 and 65. We had students from the University of Oregon do the experiment. One of us, Tversky and I, would stand in front of a group of students, spin the big wheel of luck, ask them to write down the number when the wheel stopped, which of course was either 10 or 65, and then ask them 2 questions. Do you think the number of African countries in the United Nations is bigger or smaller than the number you just wrote down? What do you think is the percentage of African countries that are members of the United Nations? Please try your best to guess. This roulette wheel is unlikely to give you any useful information, and the subjects should have ignored it. But they don't. The subjects were all affected by the message of the roulette wheel, with those who saw 10 giving a lower answer, with an average estimate of 25%, and those who saw 65 giving a higher answer, with an average estimate of 45%. The alarming message of this experiment is that you don't realize that you may have been influenced by irrelevant information, and you still think you are thinking rationally. You may say that this experiment does not represent reality, because in this experiment, the information given by the experimenter was insufficient. The subjects had no idea of the number of African member states, nor did they have any reference point, and it was only then that the subject's system took the number in the roulette wheel as a point of reference, and this affected the number of answers they gave. However, in our real world, we do not always have enough information. If you want to buy a particular watch, you may do your homework first, look up the market price on the internet, and then go to buy it after weighing the price, and then there is no limit to what tricks the salesman may try to influence you. Because you already have your own reference point, you may pay more for it, but not too much. Indeed, sufficient information can reduce the anchor effect. An objective reference point will reduce the anchor effect, but this may be limited to those who are aware of the anchor effect. Generally speaking, we all know that the merchants will deliberately raise the price. People are generally aware that different merchants will offer different prices. Some merchants will offer higher prices, so it is common to be wary of the merchants' prices. But our lives and decisions are not confined to transactions. We need to make decisions in many other areas. Let's take a look at the following experiment. The experimenter asked judges with an average of 13 years of trial experience to read the case of a woman who stole from a shopping mall, and then told them that a fictitious prosecutor had made a recommendation for a sentence that was completely random rather than a professional judgment, and that it was either 3 months or 9 months. The experimenters then asked the judge how much more or less than the prosecutor's proposed sentence he would give to the woman who stole. The average result was that the judge who was told that the prosecutor was offering 9 months would sentence her to 6 months in prison, while the judge who was told that the prosecutor was offering 3 months would sentence her to 4 months in prison. In the same experiment, a group of young lawyers were asked to read through a case of a woman who had been caught stealing from a shopping mall, and then they were asked to roll 2 rigged dice, each of which was either a 3 or a 9. When the dice stopped, the experimenters asked the lawyer how much time he would give the woman who had stolen from the mall, and whether it would be more or less than the number of dice rolled. The average result was that the judge who rolled a 9 sentenced her to 8 months in prison, while the judge who rolled a 3 sentenced her to 5 months in prison. Trained lawyers and experienced judges should have enough information to judge this kind of cases, but they still can't escape the influence of the anchor point effect. Why? The key lies in the word vigilance. The judge is of course very confident in his own judgment experience, and he doesn't think that the dice will affect his decision, so he makes his judgment intuitively, and that's why his decision is affected. When you go to buy a watch, you are generally wary of the price offered by the merchant and doubt whether it is reasonable, and you use the prices offered by other merchants as a reference. Here we get at least 2 points. In order to eliminate the anchor effect on yourself, besides having enough information, you have to be vigilant, in other words, to activate your system to think deliberately. In this way you can take a small step towards becoming a rational human being. It's really only a small step. You think you've seen it all. In the case of the judge and the watch, adequate information is a key to rational thinking, and you can rest easy knowing that it's very easy to get information nowadays. Is that really true? No, it's not that people can't or don't have access to information, it's that they don't realize they need more information, and people generally think they have enough information. Using the watch example above, how can you be sure you have enough information? Have you really found the best market price? Or is there a cheaper price somewhere that you don't know about? Your system doesn't think about these questions. It tells you that merchant A, merchant B, and merchant C have all listed the same price, so the other merchants shouldn't be able to offer a lower price. The reason for this is that the phrase, "what you see is all there is," WYSIAT, translates as "what you see is all there is," which, in clearer terms, suggests the author's point, which is, you think you see everything. Of course you know that you are not omnipotent or omniscient, but your system 1 still makes you think that you are 100% sure that the price of the watch is the cheapest, because system 1 gives you the illusion of a small sample, and comparing 3 merchants, or sometimes just 2, is enough for you to get the intuition that there can't be a cheaper price. Let's take another example. In a telephone survey of 300 seniors in the US, 60% supported the president. What does the above statement say to you? You might think that it says that more seniors in the United States support the president, but the fact is that it only says that 60% of this particular 300 seniors support the president. These 300 seniors are not representative of the entire United States, but your system would intuitively lead you to believe that these 300 seniors are enough to say that more seniors in the United States support the president. This is the so-called law of small numbers, where you make judgments based on very little evidence, usually just the evidence in front of you. You might think stocks are going to go up because you read some inside information, you might decide that a friend hates you because of something he said, or you might conclude that everything in a restaurant is bad because you ate one bad dish there. You might conclude that a mother is more likely to give birth to a woman than the average mother because she has had 4 female children in her family. In short, the automatic nature of System 1 would lead you to believe that these small samples are sufficient to tell the truth. And most of the time, System 1 will make up stories and causal relationships for these small samples, to rationalize the extreme results of these small samples on its own, as mentioned in one of the studies in the book. Tversky and his students, Tom Jelovuk and Robert Vallone, caused a stir with their research on random myths in the basketball court. Coaches, fans, and players all believe that occasionally a player on the court will have a hot hand and hit a sure shot. When a player hits 3 or 4 shots in a row, people can't help but form a causal judgment that the player has a hot hand, so he's likely to hit his next shot, and players on both sides of the court think the same thing, so their teammates pass the ball to him for a layup, and the opposing team sends twice as much manpower to defend him. But after analyzing this situation thousands of times, it turns out that there is no such thing as a hot hand, whether it's shooting or serving. Of course, some basketball players are more accurate than others, but the sequence of hitting and missing shots is perfectly consistent with chance. This means that a basketball player's consecutive shots just happen to happen, not because of some effect. But in order to explain the basketball player's streak, people can't help but make up an explanation for this particularly interesting event, namely, good luck. I think the picture above expresses this concept more clearly than words, so look at the picture for 10 seconds. Have you noticed that you can't help but notice the areas where there are many dots together, and the areas that are relatively blank? All the points in this picture are randomly distributed, so it's kind of a point-and-click picture without meaning, but since your system is always looking for cause and effect, always trying to make up a story, you can't help but notice that more points are clustered together or in a blank area, and it gives you the illusion that it's not random. This is the so-called clustering illusion. Areas where there are a lot of points close together, like when a basketball player hits a series of shots, are just clustered together, just like when a basketball player hits a series of shots, just clustered together. For example, when you have good luck one after another, you will easily notice that you are particularly lucky, and when you have bad luck, you will easily notice that you are particularly unlucky. But that's all just random distribution. It's just that the system likes to focus on these consecutive good lucks and give them a set of explanations, and that's what luck is all about. In fact, before I was introduced to this theory a few years ago, I thought that luck was controllable, that if I appreciated it and imagined it, it would happen all the time. After I realized this theory, I realized that worshipping God does not make my luck better. Even if I am particularly lucky during the period after worshipping God, it doesn't mean that it's because of worshipping God, but it's because of the random distribution of good events at the same time. However, because the system automatically interprets these successive good events as causal events, the illusion of a lucky period is created, and superstition occurs. One day, my friend told me that he had met a good feng shui master who had predicted that another friend of his would become rich, so my friend wanted to have a chat with this feng shui master. I told my friend, if I were a feng shui master, I would tell 100 people that they will be rich in the coming year, and as long as one of these 100 people is really rich, this person will feel that my words are very accurate, and he will naturally tell his friends and relatives about me, and my authority will begin to be established. The number of believers will increase. You think you have seen all, Wizzy 80, that this law predicts that one success story is enough to gain the trust of the average person, and it is. If these believers spread the word from 1 to 10, 10 to 100, then there will be a virtuous cycle, and other people who originally did not believe much will also begin to think, if this Feng Shui master is a fraud, why do so many people believe in him? Then other people who did not believe much will start to think, if this Feng Shui master is a fraud, why do so many people believe in him? In the end, the number of believers will be so large that the authority will be unshakable. All he needs to do is to continue to predict that someone will have a good year and someone will have a bad year. I don't have to do any homework for these words, but they will all come true on their own. I don't have to do any homework on these words, but they will come true on their own. There is another theory in statistics called regression toward the mean that explains why the Feng Shui master's words will come true on their own. Many companies can be categorized as very well run and less successful, and the gap between profits and stock returns for these companies, which was originally very large, shrinks to almost nothing sometime after the study. A Fortune study of the most admired companies found that after 2 decades, the companies rated worst turned out to earn more in stock returns than the most admired companies. Simply put, the great companies and the not-so-great companies are the more extreme cases, which means that these companies probably just happen to have good or bad luck, and after a while, when their luck returns to the mean, their revenues will return to the mean, i.e., to the level that they should be at. Using the example of a Feng Shui master, what is the mindset of the believers who come to me for Feng Shui? Su Ming recently had a lot of things happen in his family. He feels that his luck has suddenly dropped to the bottom. He hopes that I can turn his luck around. The reversionary mean predicts that extreme good and bad luck is temporary, and eventually all good and bad luck will return to normal. So I gave Ming a cup of talismanic water and told him that his luck would improve after drinking it. After 3 months, Ming will realize that what I said is true. This is not because my prophecy will come true on its own. In fact, even if Ming has never come to me, his luck will still improve. This is because the phrase good luck and bad luck are temporary, and in the end, all good and bad luck will return to normal is the essence of regression to the mean. Think fast, think slow talks a lot about luck. You think you're strong, but it's really just luck. In the book, Kahneman makes a disturbing discovery. Once, Kahneman was invited to give a speech to the investment commissioner of a consulting firm that provides investment advice. Kahneman asked them to provide him with some data to prepare for his presentation, and he was given a number of investment presentations detailing the investment performance of 25 investment advisors over 8 consecutive years. This allowed Kahneman to explore the question of whether a good investment advisor can perform well over the long term. To answer this question, Kahneman calculated each year's performance and obtained 28 correlation coefficients. He was surprised to find that the average of these 28 correlations was almost zero, which meant that there was almost no correlation between investment advisors' abilities and their performance, and that if anyone performed well or poorly, it was just luck. This is similar to what you would see in a dice rolling contest. It's not a contest of skill, it's a contest of luck. To put it another way, Kahneman summarized the performance of investors and found that if you let an average person into the company and invested based on the results of dice rolls, over the long term, that average person would perform about as well as the professional investors inside the company. Another study presented in another book has a similar conclusion. Funds, mutual funds, are usually run by experienced, hard-working professionals who buy and sell stocks in the best interests of their clients. However, 50 years of research evidence points to the fact that in any given year, at least 2 out of every 3 funds perform below market levels. What's more, the correlation between fund performance in any given year is so low that it's better than 0.1%, and the success of any given fund in any given year is a matter of luck. Most researchers agree that almost all stock pickers are betting on chance, and whether they know it or not, they are in fact betting on luck, and I think most of them don't know it and think they are accurate. Kahneman want to say the key point is, in this investment, the correlation coefficient of luck is 0.99 or so, while the correlation coefficient of technology is 0.01 or so, which means that it does not matter whether you have investment technology. Perhaps there are many people still feel unthinkable, and even feel very unconvinced, always feel as if missing something. I personally is one of them so feel. Is human capacity really so limited? Contrary to our experience, we know that we get better and better at driving, and that racers are certainly better than the average person, and that even if we are sometimes slowed down by luck, most of the time our skills allow us to get to our destination safely. Kahneman doesn't say that every technology is irrelevant, but rather that the correlation coefficient of technology is very low when it comes to the extreme matter of investment. But why is that? Kahneman gave the answer: because the real world is too complex, the market has too much uncertainty. In a situation full of uncertainty, people will still use their own intuition to generalize their experience, which creates a technical illusion. An investor will think that he has made a profit because he is right about a certain stock, and he can explain why he chose this stock, give a detailed analysis, and cite countless reasons. But statistics show that the profits are simply the result of good events that happen to be distributed to these stocks by random chance. If you happen to be an investor or are interested in investing in stocks, you don't have to feel angry or discouraged because there is a solution, it's just not detailed in Kahneman's book. Here are some key points from the book. 1 volume of System 1 and System 2. 1. System 1 is automated, very fast and effortless, with little if any effort, and it is not under autonomous control. 2. System 2 uses attention to perform laborious mental activities, including complex computations. The operation of System 2 is usually associated with subjective experiences of agents, choices, and attention. 3. Interaction between System 1 and System 2. System 1 advises System 2, giving it impressions, intuitions, intentions, and sensations. Once recognized by System 2, impressions and intuitions are transformed into beliefs, and impulses are transformed into spontaneous actions. When the system encounters a problem, it calls on System 2 for support, suggesting more detailed and specific ways to solve the problem. System 2 has the final say. One of System 2's jobs is to counteract System 1's impulses. System 2 is in charge of self-control. 4. However, there are no real System 1 and System 2 in the brain, but two fictional systems used by the authors to facilitate the explanation. 2. Self-control requires attention and effort. Controlling thoughts and behaviors is one of the responsibilities of System 2. Being too concerned about one's performance on a particular task sometimes interferes with that performance because short-term memory is filled with meaningless anxious thoughts. 3. The baseball and ball test, an example of System 1 and System 2 in action. 1. Problem: a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? 2. When the experiment was conducted, 50% of the top college students in the US answered 10 cents. 3. If we use the system's intuitive response, the answer will be 10 cents. But the actual answer is 5 cents. If you can avoid this trap on behalf of the active mind to turn off the System 2 mode of thinking. 4. A high IQ does not necessarily make one immune to prejudice, which involves the ability of rationality. 5. The illusion of truth: if a piece of a familiar sentence or a whole sentence sounds familiar, it is easy to accept it as true. The way to convince people of a fallacy is to repeat it over and over again, because it is difficult to tell the difference between familiarity and truth. Familiarity comes from System 1, and System 2 makes a right or wrong judgment based on that familiarity. 6. If you want to be perceived as reliable, intelligent, and wise, don't use complicated language, but try to express yourself in simple sentences. 7. Intentional attribution. Intentional attribution: people tend to link up cause and effect relationships that are not necessarily right to explain the cause of a thing, but often due to the system of a failure to correctly determine and produce the wrong attribution. 8. Halo effect. Halo effect. When you like a person, you tend to like everything about him, including those that are not observed. The halo effect increases the weight of the first impression. 9. Problems arising from the principle of small numbers. 1. Large samples are more statistically accurate than small samples. Smaller samples will produce more variable results and mislead about the cause and effect. 2. But System 1 is not good at doubting, suppressing uncertainty, and automatically constructing stories to make everything seem plausible so that unless it is immediately rejected, the message will be taken as true, which in turn will stimulate linkage diffusion. 3. System 2 can suspect and maintain two incompatible possibilities at the same time, but it is harder to suspect than to maintain. The principle of fractions is an example of System 1's preference for certainty over doubt, so people strongly believe that small samples represent a large body, they tend to exaggerate the consistency and reasonableness of what they see. 10. Anchor effect. People's judgment will be influenced by a number that is not informative in any way. If the seller offers a high price, the transaction price may also become high. The way to overcome this is to focus on the other party's reserve price or what the other party's loss will be if the deal doesn't work out. This can help minimize the anchor point effect. 11. Emotional shortcuts. Answers to easy questions. How do I feel about it? Replacing a difficult question, what do I think about him? The answer to the easy question, how do I feel about it, replaces the harder question, what do I think about him? 12. The meaning of Bayesian statistics and reasoning. Bayesian statistics. 1. Bayesian reasoning suggests that prior beliefs should be combined with a diagnosis of the evidence to see the degree of bias in favor of your hypothesis and rejection of another possible hypothesis. 2. The keys to Bayesian reasoning. A. Anchor your probability judgment at the most likely probability. B. Questioning the diagnosis of the evidence. 13. Less is more. 1. Thinking in terms of symptomatic judgment rather than probability can be a probable cause of error. 2. Pairing a very cheap gift with a very expensive item makes the whole deal unattractive. Less is more. 3. Comparison reduces the likelihood of error compared to individual judgment. 14 steps for making reasonable predictions with intuition and corrections. 1. Use the odds of the baseline as the odds of the forecast. Find out what the average result is. 2. Make an intuitive prediction. 3. Target the prediction between the baseline and the intuition. In the absence of useful information, the former is preferred. 4. In other extreme cases and when there is supporting evidence, the prediction can still be made intuitively. 5. Doubting the correlation between the original judgment and the truth, the final judgment should be between the two extremes. 15. The social cost of horseshoeing. 1. When an event does occur, people will exaggerate the odds given to them before the event, i.e., they will over-exaggerate their own correctness. 2. The harms of horse trading bias to society include: A. Observers will only look at the consequences when evaluating a decision, rather than the procedural rights and wrongs. B. It will have an unfair effect on the policy maker, who tends to blame the decision maker, regardless of whether the decision was a good one or a bad one. This is also one of the reasons why bureaucracy arises rather than risking bad consequences. 3. Actions that seem prudent beforehand can be viewed as irresponsible afterward. 4. The worse the consequences, the greater the prejudice against horseplay. The author cites the example of the CIA being blamed for failing to act on a tip-off 2 months before 9/11. 16. Some people use theories to explain everything, which gives them the false impression that they know everything about the world. 17. The question is not whether these experts are well trained, but whether the world is predictable. 18. Judgments and formulas. 1. When formulas can be substituted for human judgment, they should be. 2. Self-awareness is valuable, but only when objective information is gathered in a disciplined manner and scores are assigned to items in a disciplined manner. 3. Don't trust intuitive judgment, but don't throw it away either. 19. When can you trust intuition or expert judgment? 1. A very regular, predictable environment. E.g., driving is fine, but the stock market is difficult. 2. A chance to learn the rules through long practice. 3. Factors that stock market and political experts often fail to predict, trying to predict a largely unpredictable event. 4. Subjective self-confidence is a poor indicator of accuracy. 20. Use of outside view to minimize misjudgment. 1. The optimistic bias of thinking that a project can be completed earlier is called planning fallacy. 2. Reference class forecasting reduces miscalculation by a. Identifying the appropriate reference class, b. Obtaining this type of statistical data, and c. Adjusting the base case forecast with special information about the case. 21. Overconfidence and prevention. 1. Overconfidence is caused by the illusion of control, neglect by competitors, and the belief that one knows more than one really does. 2. Experts who confess their ignorance are replaced by competitors who are more confident and trusted by their clients. Individuals and organizations reward those who provide dangerous misinformation far more than those who tell the truth. 3. The optimistic style is, success is due to me, failure is due to a small oversight on my part. 4. Prevent overconfidence and the mechanism of no one dare to oppose the decision after the decision has been made by the principal person by means of prior review meeting. 22. Prospect theory. 1. 3 qualities. A. Assessment is relative to a neutral reference point. B. The principle of diminishing sensitivity applies to changes in senses and assessment of wealth. C. Loss avoidance. Loss brings a greater sense of asymmetry than gain. 2. Loss aversion triggers extreme risk-averse choices in mixed gambles where both gains and losses are possible. Diminishing sensitivity triggers risky behavior in the choice between certainty of loss and the possibility of greater loss. The pain of a sure loss of $900 is greater than the pain of a 90% chance of losing $1,000. 3. The loss aversion ratio is about 1.5 to 2.5. A win of $200 will offset the pain of losing $100. 23. Endowment effect. 1. The traditional economic analysis of the invariant curve is based on the fact that the state of preferences is only related to the present. However, in reality, people's preferences are not fixed, but will change according to the reference point. When it changes, the disadvantages will be magnified, and they will be bigger than the advantages. Similar to loss aversion. 2. Once a person owns something, he will increase the value of that thing because he does not want to lose it, that is to say, the lowest price at which he is willing to sell it will be much higher than the highest price at which he is willing to buy it. This is the effect of a gift. 3. A person who buys a house at a high price will set a higher price when he sells his house and is willing to spend more time selling his house. 4. Experienced traders will minimize the existence of the possessive effect. A trader who actually owns something for a while and then trades it is more likely to have a proprietary effect. 24. About loss. 1. The person who suffers a loss will fight harder than the person who receives a gain. 2. The asymmetry of the loss makes it more painful for the conceding party. Therefore, it is easier to renegotiate the distribution of the pie than to distribute the loss. 3. Customers are more likely to accept price increases in the face of higher costs. 25. When a very unlikely event becomes the center of our attention, we give it a much greater weight than its chances deserve. 26. 4-quadrant preference, different behaviors under different chances, gains, and losses. 1. Under high odds, certainty effect. A. Gain, 95% win $10,000. Fear of disappointment, risk aversion. I.e., when one thinks there is a good chance of getting a large gain, one will be risk averse and willing to accept lower conditions than expected to ensure that one will get the gain. B. Loss, 95% lose $10,000. Wish to avoid loss, risk seeking. When people are faced with very bad options, they have to take a desperate gamble in exchange for a tiny hope of minimizing a big loss. 2. At low odds, likelihood effect. A. Get, 5% to win $10,000. Hope to win a big prize, risk-seeking. Reasons for buying lottery tickets, B. Loss, 5% lose $10,000. Fear of big losses, risk avoidance. Reasons for buying insurance. 3. The reason for abusive litigation, the plaintiff is at a low chance of winning a large amount of money, risk-seeking, while the defendant is at a low chance of losing a large amount of money, unintentional catastrophe, and will be risk-averse, insurance behavior, so in this case the plaintiff is willing to gamble, while the defendant wants to play it safe. 4. As long as there is the slightest chance of a draw, they will not stop losing, which is risk-seeking at a loss. 27 reasons for overreaction to rare events. 1. The effect of System 1 on mood and image clarity increases availability and judgmental probability. 2. However, from the perspective of Taleb, the author of Black Swan, it is not unreasonable to overreact to rare events because they are unbearable to face even if the chance of their occurrence is small. 3. In order to make people worry about the risk, the description is changed to 1 death per 1,000 people, so that people will ignore the denominator effect and become more aware of the risk. 28 Narrow and wide frames. 1. Narrow frames are for only 2 or a few choices, wide frames are for comparing many different choices and choosing the better one. Human beings are narrow-framed by nature. 2. Decision, 1. Sure to get $240, B. 25% chance to get $1,000, 75% chance to get nothing, decision, 2. C. Sure to lose $750, D. 75% chance to lose $1,000, 25% chance to get nothing. 3. If you evaluate only A and B, you will choose A. If you evaluate only C and D, you will choose D. This is because System 1 reacts emotionally to certainty of getting and certainty of losing. 4. The combination AD wins $240 25% of the time and loses $750 75% of the time. The combination BC wins $250 25% of the time and loses $750 75% of the time. Generally, most people would choose the BC combination. However, previously, B and C were not selected when they were chosen individually. Wide frames are better than narrow frames for decision making. 29 Loss avoidance and prevention of the curse of narrow framing. 1. Observe performance less frequently to minimize pain and loss of position. 2. Watch stocks on a quarterly or longer basis rather than daily to avoid the emotion of seeing short-term losses outweighing short-term gains and increasing the chance of bad decisions. Avoid useless worries. 3. A combination of external views and risk policies can achieve the goal of removing over-optimism and over-avoidance of losses. That is to say, the function of changing from narrow frame to wide frame can be achieved. 30 Disposition effect. 1. Most people will sell stocks that make money rather than stocks that lose money. This is called the disposition effect. 2. A rational investor should focus on the future prospects of a stock rather than on its profit or loss. 31 Neuroeconomics and framing effect. 1. Neuroeconomics deals with the activation of the human brain when making decisions. 2. A place associated with emotion, the amygdala, is most likely to be activated when a subject chooses to engage in framing. System 1 work. 3. A place associated with conflict and self-control, anterior cingulate, which is heavily activated when subjects do not do what comes naturally to them, choosing the sure thing even when they see a loss, and which resists System 1's tendency to react. 4. In the most rational subjects, i.e., those who are not affected by framing effects, there will be a large amount of activation in the frontal lobe, which is the place where emotions and reason are combined to make decisions. 5. The survival rate 1 month after surgery is 90% and the mortality rate the first month after surgery is 10%. 84% of the doctors in the former chose surgery, while 50% of the doctors in the latter chose laser treatment. This is a manifestation of the frame mentality. 32 Experiential utility and pain perception. 1. Experiments with humans have shown that patients' responses to pain, A, are more sensitive to the peak, when it hurts the most, and the end of the pain than to other periods, B, are less sensitive to the duration of the pain. People's experience is judged more in relation to the intensity of the feeling rather than the whole experience and feeling. 2. The memory self is more important than the experiential self. The experiential self emphasizes the present feeling, while the memory self focuses on the actual situation of the whole period. 3. System 1 represents the average, the norm, and the typical, not the sum. In order to avoid decisions that do not produce the best possible experience and decisions that incorrectly predict future feelings, the objective observer should assess the sum and the totality, not the intuitive feelings. 4. From this point of view, in many of our evaluations of historical figures, if we only evaluate a certain major event, but not the whole paragraph, will it be misleading to the real evaluation of a person? This is also a possible example of less is more bias. 33. How to increase happiness? 1. Mindfulness, the happiness of the mind that is willing to continue and unwilling to stop. It is the state of forgetfulness that people feel when they devote themselves to something. Interruptions at this time are not welcome. 2. U-index, the percentage of time a person spends in an unpleasant state. Policy aims to reduce the U-index in society, and dealing with the depression of the very poor should be a priority. 3. Ways to enhance experience, to switch from passive leisure, e.g. watching TV, to active recreation, e.g. making friends, exercising. 4. People experience happiness as living the life they want. Happiness is a judgment people make when evaluating their lives. 5. Poverty makes people sad. Wealth enhances a person's satisfaction with life, but does not increase experienced happiness. Surveys have shown that after income exceeds $75,000, experiential well-being no longer rises, perhaps because higher incomes are associated with a reduced ability to enjoy life's little pleasures. 34. Focusing illusion. 1. When you are thinking about it, there is nothing in life more important than it. Once the system replaces the whole thing with the immediate or a certain thing or a small part of life, the attention is directed to any aspect of life, which is immediately magnified. Therefore, when we do an overall assessment, we only see it, which is an illusion of focus. 2. If you feel that the weather in California is good, you will think that people who live in California will be happier than those who live elsewhere. However, people who have just moved there may feel this way, but people who have lived in California for a long time do not have a higher sense of well-being than those who live elsewhere. 35. Two selves vs. two systems and applications. 1. The memory self, a construct of System 2, is the self that keeps score and makes choices for you. The experience self is the self that lives your life for you. 2. System 1 thinks intuitively and quickly, while System 2 thinks laboriously and slowly, and monitors System 1 to the best of its ability and resources. 3. Neglect of time duration and the peak end rule, which leads to a bias toward short-term pleasures and away from long-lasting micro-happiness. Experiences and feelings come from System 1, but they do not necessarily echo the values of System 4. Behavioral economists believe that life is much more complicated than the claims of those who believe humans are rational, and some favor policies that nudge people to avoid making bad choices. 5. Groups do a better job of avoiding mistakes than individuals because they are slower to think, have the power to require orderly processes, and have mandatory checklists. 36. Application to investment and points to note. 1. The daily upward or downward movement of stocks or the stock market may not necessarily be the cause of what the media says or what you think, so avoid overly consistent and coherent assumptions. 2. A certain factor may not necessarily be the reason for the stock market or stock market's decline or future performance. To avoid narrow frame effect and overconfidence misjudgment, you should take out all the factors affecting the stock market and evaluate them one by one. 3. Evaluate each factor with observable objective data, supplemented by external views, to minimize the possibility of subjective misjudgment. 4. establish a systematic checklist for the investment process to reduce the speed and increase the quality of decision making, and to avoid the possibility of misjudgment once the system is in place. 5. A company's past performance or impression is not indicative of what it will be like in the future. Avoid the halo effect and reevaluate carefully. 6. Certainty of growth or stable growth may lead to a higher evaluation of the stock price in the event that people prefer certainty in the system. 7. When a stock goes down, those who already hold it may continue to want to hold it. Having lost it will trigger the effect of excessive risk-seeking, but those who don't hold it won't want to buy it. In case of loss it will bring more pain. 8. Stocks should be decided on the basis of future investment prospects, not the cost of holding them or whether they have made a profit or loss. Avoid the disposal effect. 9. Reduce the frequency of watching the stock market or stocks because seeing frequent short-term declines creates pain and may lead to bad decisions. 10. The stock market and stocks are more unpredictable than you think. Do not buy the stock, or avoid the decline. Do not say that you knew it would be so. Why did not buy, or sell, not only is not very meaningful, but also may cause the bad consequences of chasing the high and killing the low in the future. Avoid the horse hindsight effect. 11. To find a soaring stock, or performance is very good, as far as possible is to perfect the investment preparation and process to explain. Do not think you suddenly do something right. This will be mistaken for their own really mean God. Focus on the illusion. 12. Whether the investment process is reasonable and systematized, rather than only look at the short-term or current performance status of the good and bad, to determine the quality of a manager, so as not to produce prejudice or unnecessary depletion of talent. Avoid replacing the judgment of memory self with experience self. Kahneman reinterprets the relationship between decision-making and judgment, risk, happiness, and wealth, overturning economics' assumption that human decision-making is rational, and revealing for the first time how intuitive bias and logical shortcuts can unknowingly determine what we think is good for us in our lives and in society, and will radically change the way you think about thinking. That's why the authors say that if you want to avoid mistakes, you have to realize that human thinking is not as trustworthy as we think it is. Sometimes we make what we think are rational decisions, but in fact they are only intuitive responses of System 1, and it is not easy to determine whether the decision is made by System 1 or System 2. So what we can do is to be more skeptical and reflective about our first reactions, not because we don't trust our intuition, but because we need to understand how our thinking process is affected, so that we can make carefully thought-out decisions. The book culminates in an elevated discussion of how these two systems affect not only our decision-making, but also our outlook on life. Kahneman believes that thinking holistically prevents us from focusing on individual mistakes, which in turn enhances our overall well-being.